Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzagari. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for that kind introduction. Glad to see so many familiar faces here. And as Dr. Kuzagari mentioned, I do work on East Iran. I try to use material culture as much as I can, although as odd as that would sound today, I will mostly rely on a set of written texts with which many of you are already familiar, and the information that I'm trying to extract from them. This is probably too cheeky of me and too kind of Dr. Kuzagari to invite me at this stage, because this is something I'm working on for a book project on the Silk Road, or lack thereof. And I'm concentrating, this is basically a chapter of the book on urbanization in Central Asia and on generally city life and the relations between the city and the hinterland in this region during late antiquity. So what I'm presenting, even in the best of times, would be a work in progress. So please forgive me if it is not necessarily the best presentation you have heard. But again, I thank you for your understanding. Okay, so Bactria of 1,000 cities. I have to actually acknowledge from the beginning that I owe the title to sort of an article that has influenced me for this. So I'm mostly interested in this presentation on the question of the existence of cities, and rather their proliferation in Bactria in East Iran during late antiquity, and generally the idea of city foundations and living in cities, which is quite fascinating. Why would the social structure actually lead you towards that? What is the function of the cities in this region? And also their mention in the Bactrian documents with which many of you are familiar, and I shall mention briefly about their background. So this is sort of where I'm going to go during the presentation, so having it as a bit of a foreshadowing. I'm going to start with the first subject of Miirosan as East Iran, or what I imagine would be a translation of the Indic Udayaditya, the East. And why I'm calling this East Iran, I want to be clear. I am not doing it in any manner in the way of what might be imagined as nationalistic, claiming that, you know, the whole thing is Iran, and going from the point of view of modern Iran, but rather of the cultural setting, and actually quite against the idea that what is country of Iran today is the entirety of the culture, and that the country owning the name means that the country actually dictates who is Iran and who is not. So I'm not using Eastern Iran, I'm actually using East Iran in the sort of an air of, I don't know, imagine, we have had a lot of East, West, and South, North differentiations in different countries. I'm imagining that the name that a lot of time was used for this region, whether it is Miirosan or Khorasan, which is more familiar, which means the East, is imagining that it is the East of something. And as I always jokingly say, there is a lot east of Afghanistan. There is Turkestan, there is China, there is Japan, there's California. It's not the east of the world, so it could not have imagined itself as the eastern part of the world, but that is an eastern part of some sort of a cultural entity, which I'm imagining is the Iran, of which, for example, at the time, the Sasanian Empire is the West. So you could say Sasanians are the West Iran, while this space, which is, I call it Kushan space, is the East Iran. And in here, Kushans particularly play an important role, although they are not the ones I'm concentrating on today. I think the area between Central Asia, Bactria, the Kabul region, the Kabul Ghazni region, the Parapamizdai, Arachosia, and then down to the Indus region, Gandhara, and down to the Indus region. I think during the Kushan period, becomes part of the part of the Kushan norms, and really forms into this idea, particularly the northern part, into this coherent idea of Kushan Shah, whose relation with Miirosan I'm actually trying to sort of figure out in here. But I think Kushans, basically through the politics and their conquest, and generally the force of geography of the mountains and of the sort of flatlands in the east, are creating this idea of Kushan Shah and are planting the seeds of Miirosan, or East Iran. But really what's of my interest here is post-Kushan realities, the period that, you know, gets generally loosely called the period of the Iranische Hunnen in German, the Iranian Huns, which are generally divided based on numismatic reasons to the kingdoms of the Kidarites, then the successor kingdoms of the Alkhans, the Heftalites, and the Nizak Shahs. And really they forming the basis of what I'm saying, and particularly obviously the Alkhans and the Heftalites in the context I'm talking about. And also the creation of the idea of the imperial Tukharistan, basically imperial Bactria, and this idea of the king of the east, this Miirosan Shah, that gets repeated in several numismatic sources and generally seems to continue through the idea of Khorasan and through the various characters, including Mehama Meyam, one of the characters mentioned both in coins and in the Bactria documents. And finally, really, Sasanian Khorasan and early Islamic Khorasan. I want to mention here the Bactrian documents that I keep on referring to. If somebody by an off chance, I would imagine it's impossible, nobody has heard of them, somebody has not heard of them. There are a number of documents written in Bactrian, found in various places, usually out of context and markets, that have been translated in the past 20 years by, well, really done 10 years ago by Professor Nicholas Sims Williams, and which include a number of information in them, which hasn't really been, in my opinion, studied well enough. Linguistically, there has been a lot of studies of it. Professor Sims Williams and a number of other scholars have worked on the chronology in it and several other aspects. But I feel like because the historical information in the way that we traditionally think of history, basically political history and the history of the known and great men, is kind of unknown in them, they are not really treated as historical documents very well so far. And I think a lot of people, including people working on urban history, can extract quite a bit of information from them. So this is an attempt, let's say, at doing that. And this is what I'm calling that Kushan space, the Kushan Empire. So extending from the borders of Central Asia, in this map, I haven't really included the areas of Samarkand and Kurdistan in general, because I would imagine that they are not under necessarily very strict Kushan control. This is a fight that I should pick on separately with people. But generally, the space that I am referring to is the area that I'm calling Tukharistan. And this is where I'm going to concentrate most of the talk today. So let's say Greater Bactria. And the reason I'm using the title Tukharistan, because I'm sort of buying the idea that the Kushans are the people after whom this region is named, that they are the Tukhar. So I'm calling the core of the, sort of loosely and based on my own ideas, calling the core of the kingdom as Tukharistan. So Imperial Tukharistan is sort of a creation of mine. I'm not saying that this really actually exists within that context anyway. And this is really the region as we talk about it today. I want to bring your attention, people who have seen the Bactrian documents are familiar with this, but this is sort of the theater of events. The Bactrian documents, as we have them, concentrate around the city of Robe, which is now north of Bamiyan, in the mountains north of Bamiyan near Barfak, and the close by city of Madr or Malr, which seems to be the name of the district as well. And it mentions places such as Samangan, as Samingan, obviously, Anbir, Termez. And interestingly enough, the city of Balkh only once is mentioned. Bamiyan is also mentioned, which could have been hard actually to miss in some senses. So sort of this very limited area is where the documents concentrate and where we have some of the information. The rest of this, obviously, we have from other historical sources, which I shall mention in passing. Sort of historically speaking, the region that they have marked in sort of light purple is the region that gets conquered by the lords of this particular area, the people who are actually ruling over Khodada, the Hephthalites, after 484, when the Sasanian emperor Peroz is killed. And I would imagine much of East Iran falls to the Hephthalites, and also much of the eastern part of the Sasanian Empire falls to them. So this is sort of, I would say, at the 6th century scene, and some of the information of the Bactrian documents comes from this period. And we have mention of the Hephthalite tax and other things which sort of give us some information about the administration, but as I will go through, you will see that there are other things I'm interested in. I thought of showing you this particular coin. This is the coin of an authority called Zabokhu, who on the coin calls himself Miirosan Shah. The coins are of distinct type. They are generally within the coinage series of the Al-Khans, so one of the series of Hunnic authorities. Although they are not exactly the style of the rest of the Al-Khan series, they still have some of the elongated skull that we are used to seeing in Al-Khan coin series. They have the prominent nose and eyes and eyebrows, particularly shaved face, large earring. So we could recognize them as generally Al-Khan coins, but they're different and their own type. And as I mentioned, on them, there is a mention of Zabukho, king of the East. And now, we don't exactly know where this East is. That's why I particularly talk about the next authority, Meyam, who on his coins calls himself Mehama, on the coins is called Mehama, and is also in a copper scroll, is called the king Mehama. But he's in the Bactrian documents mentioned as Meyam, the king of the people of Kadag, earlier date than 484. He is called the governor of the famous and prosperous king of kings, Peroz. The reason I'm particularly connecting Zabukho and Meyam, other than the similarity of the coinage type, particularly the device you can see here in front of their faces, which shows them to be of similar types, is that I'm drawing a picture of a political world in which the eastern part of Bactria, so let me go back to the map, please. The eastern part of Tukharistan, so this region, so the region of Talekan, Warwal is generally the Badakhshan area, is starting to form some sort of authority of its own. Meyam is mentioned in the Rob documents and seems to be the king of a particular region, Kadagestan, which is otherwise mentioned again as as another king of the Kadagestan area is also mentioned, and seems to be the greatest authority besides a king of Ghur or Ghar towards the west that is mentioned. So I am positing, I have argued otherwise, that the eastern part of Bactria, this region, being directly to the north of Kapisi, where we know the Kabul area, we know was a center of the Al-Khan coin production, and considering that these are also Al-Khan coins, that this eastern part of Bactria, place that is called Miirosan, or where Mayam calls himself the king of Kazakhstan, is actually should be put under the general rubric of the Al-Khan rule, not the Heptalite rule, which we are used to seeing in the Balkh area, particularly in 484 and later. And the way I am reconstructing the historical setting is that Mayam originally is a governor of Peroz in eastern Bactria. And he probably is somebody who is somehow helping the Sasanians. But this whole thing changes in 484 when Peroz is killed and when Sasanians lose any control over the east at all, where Mayam becomes this independent king and really becomes one of the founders of this kingdom that I'm calling Imperial Tukharistan, or the kingdom of the Imperial Heftalites, as it been called. So this is the way I'm reconstructing this. That Mayam is an eastern supporter of Peroz, originally ruling in his place, and then becoming independent following Peroz's death, and that this east particularly gaze through the similarities between the coins that we have is the root of Khorasan, and we'll see how I'm hoping to argue through that. But more than political science, I'm interested in the sort of the social situation here, and particularly the urban setting, and how the area forms into something that later, again politically, we have the presence of somebody called Tegin Khorasan Shah, this time written in Middle Persian, and probably in the early 8th century, so already in the Islamic period, where this identity of Khorasan is again revived. And this person actually claims himself to be the king of Khorasan, again from this region. This is obviously the father of the famous From Kesar, who is the king of Kabul. So again, the region is east, of course, a bit south from the area that I'm arguing for, but I would imagine it's the sort of holder of the legacy of the earlier kings of Miirosan or East Iran. And so this is the bigger theater of events. So I want to put it in the context of the Sasanian Empire. So this is the Sasanians, this is the eastern kingdoms we're talking about. The green part is the Heptalite kingdom, and this area to the west is the conquests of the Heftalites. The orange part is the kingdom of the Nizak Shahs, which we wouldn't mention, and the sort of pinkish part is the region of Al-Khan rule, and that the area that I've actually made with this boundary is where I'm arguing that this kingdom of the east is really existing. So north of Kabul, east of Balkh. Now, to get to urban life, in this political reality that we are defining here, and based on various sources that we have mention of a lot of different settings for the life of the people. And I think this is where we should concentrate, and this is where we should sort of gaze our attention away from the political history. The evidence we have include Shahristani-hai Iran-Shahr, the famous Middle Persian text, which seems to have reached this final recension that has reached us sometimes in the early 9th century during the Caliphate of Al-Ma'mun, or maybe a bit before that. But there is a mention of the city of Baghdad in it, which certainly marks it as after 775. So maybe late 8th century, early 9th century. As many of you know, Shahristani divides the Sasanian Empire into the 4 pusts, the 4 districts, or ispahdetships, if you want to call them, that have now been ascertained by the discovery of the seals related to them, which Professor Rika Gizlan has published and has made available kindly to everybody. So we now know that this is the reality. It's not just a historiographical sort of topos, and it exists. In the Shahristaniha, the eastern coast, the Kusti Khurasan, is said to have many cities in it. And of course, the foundations are always associated with the legendary founders, some of them with known Sasanian kings, but a lot of them are actually with mythological or legendary characters. Of the region we are concerned with, only 2 cities, if you even want to sort of extend it, are mentioned. One of them is in the line 8, where it says, in the brilliant Balkh Bamig, in Middle Persian, the city of Nawazag was built by Spandiad, the son of Vushtas. So the city of Nawazag obviously itself is not mentioned, and it's interesting that it calls it in Balkh Bamig. So it's considered Balkh to be the name of a region or a district, and mentioning a particular city founded by Spandiad, the son of Vushtas. And the only other city in the vicinity that is mentioned is the city of Marvrud, which is said to have been founded by Wahram, the son of Yazgird. So Wahram V, the famous Wahram Sasanian king. So these are the only ones that we get from Shahristaniya Iranchar. The rest of the cities mentioned by Shahristaniya in Khurasan happen to be in the Sasanian region of Abar Shahr, or in the regions of Sogdiana and beyond, and also in Sistan region. So for Shahristaniya, Sistan also counts as part of Khurasan. Whether that would be exact or not is another matter. But in our region, we really only have the city of Nawazag said to be in the region of Balkh Bamig, the brilliant Balkh. However, the Bactrian documents provide a whole lot of information for us. Some of these are actually marked clearly as regions, or things that with the words that we can refer to. So districts, cities, boroughs, fortresses are actually directly mentioned. Things such as the Tukharistan or Qarchistan is not actually mentioned as a distinctive, geographically clear area. But for example, there is a judge of Tukharistan and Qarchistan, which is mentioned, which doesn't really make it clear where these entities are, but seem to imply that they are in the region where, for example, Rob itself is included. There are several references to places that we could call kingdoms. I think the title might be a bit stretching it. For example, Rob in particular being called the kingdom, I would like to liken it more to a medieval European princedom, or even something like a duchy or something. But there are, for example, Mayam is mentioned as the king of the people of Kadag, and the king of Kadagstan is actually mentioned. So Kadagstan seems to be a kingdom. Gyar also seems to be a kingdom, of the mountains. Whether this is actually Gyar or Gur, or basically the origins of Gur, as I have suggested, I'm not sure. But anyway, the king is mentioned. Pidud is also mentioned as somewhere that has a khar. So if we imagine Rob is in fact a kingdom, the khar of Pidud could be called the king of Pidud as well. But again, I probably should just remove Rob and Pidud and put them under something like a principality, or something akin to a duchy. Things such as district is very clearly mentioned, although it's not always clear where they refer to something as district with this word odago, whether they mean necessarily always a larger district, because something like Madr, for example, is also mentioned as a shahr, as a city, as also Madr and Malj. But Samingan, for example, is always mentioned as a district, not as a city, and that is a district. Whether Sozargan or Ramin are actually districts, I wasn't sure where to put them there. Cities, particularly of interest to us. So the subdivision of that, are famous places like Tirmidh, Bamiyan, Balkh, which is surprisingly only mentioned once. So contrast with Shahristaniya Iran Shah's characterization of Balkh as, the place, and the city of Balkh, which here is Nabozag, as the place. Balkh is only mentioned once in the Bactrian documents. Rob is obviously a Shahr, other cities, Warnu and others. Some of them are only mentioned once in one document, so we don't know much about them. The most common ones are Rob and Madr, actually, and Rob by far takes over. Mention of boroughs also, although they are not always mentioned where they are, how they relate to the city, but they seem to be a subdivision of the city, although at times the word Rizdo or Rizindo is also used to refer to an estate. So when it is in the rural context, it's used to refer to a estate which is being sold or bought. So whether it is an actual borough as in the meaning of a neighborhood of a city is unclear. But we do have quite clear references sometimes. So you have the mention of the borough of Regan and the fortress of Kah, for example, the fortress, the Liz of Kah, is actually clearly mentioned. Several fortresses are mentioned, particularly that Kah, but also Burzawid and Zubair. Bamiyan is interestingly also mentioned to be a fortress. And at least in one case, we have a market town of Marogan. It's not mentioned as market town, it's mentioned as Marogan, where the market overseer of the Khar of Rob actually lives. So I don't have a Bactrian words for it, but I would imagine it's a market town or a market area of the actual city. So this is sort of the physical distribution of the region and how the administration works, up from a greater region to domain and down to a fortress, essentially. So again, this is the area we are talking about, Rob and Madr, just north of Bamiyan and northwest of Kabul, south of Balkh and Termez. Samangan would be around the area where the word Bactrian in German is actually written. This comes from the excellent online exhibition of the project Countenance of the Other, which was taken on by University of Vienna and the museum in, I believe, Basel. In Bern, in Switzerland. So the maps I've taken the liberty of using. So this is generally again the region we're talking about, where it's marked with green. Now, moving on to the city life. What the Bactrian documents are managed is I have really organized it based on the information we have, but don't necessarily treat my divisions, particularly the order of the things, as indicating a clear order reflected in the text, rather as something that I imagine would have been the case. Sometimes things are clearly mentioned. So as you saw, Mayam calls himself the governor of the great king of kings, Peroz, but later calls himself the king as well. So I put the governor either the king under the king of kings. So that can be exact. But for example, putting a satrap under a governor is something that I have sort of done. A satrap could have as well been more authoritative or have authority over a larger area than a governor does. So that's my sort of organization of it, and I'm very open to changing that organization. The uppermost level we have is this great Kushan king, which is mentioned very early on, which is Bahram, which seems to be referring to the last king of the Kushano-Sasanian dynasty, before the area is probably reorganized into the kingdom of the Kedarites. So quite an early on, but this is the only mention of it in the text. There is the King of Kings, which is mostly mentioned in the context of Peroz. And then there is the Khagan, which comes at a later date. and seems to be the person to whom Khar of Rob is actually referred. Khar of Rob considers himself to be an authority, particularly this Tapakhlıq Iltabir, or the Rutbil of the Khagan. So puts this local administrative position under the Khagan's authority. Governor of the Kadagbid and Shah, I have taken to be the same, mainly because of Mayam's position, calling himself king of the people of Kadag and the governor of the king of kings. So I'm imagining that these two are in authority somehow in the same level. Satrap is obviously the old Iranian title coming from the Achaemenids. Sharab, which very clearly refers to the Shar, to the city. So it's the city authority, at least in name. And then you have the, for a period, you have the reference to the Yabghu of the Heftal, or Ebodal or Yabghu, which is, seems to be a particular position created under the Heftalites. In the local administration, what we see mostly is the title of the Khar, which is given to the ruler of Rob, but there are other Khars as well, including the Khar of Pidud. Scribe of the Heftalites, which is an interestingly constructed word. So the Heptalite Lord's Writer is an interesting title, only mentioned once. I just put it up here, but I don't think it is of much importance. It seems to be very honorary. It's the last title mentioned in a document for somebody. And I imagine it's mostly an honorary document, honorary title, but it might refer to some sort of an administrative position within the Heptalite court. Again, the Tapakhlıq Iltabir is a unique mention, but the word Iltabir over there might refer to, in fact, the title that we know from the Islamic sources as Rutbil. I have misspelled Iltabir here, sorry about that. The title we have references to as Rutbil, which is the king of Kabulistan and probably the Ghazni region in the early Islamic period, sometimes referred to incorrectly in mostly edited versions of medieval Persian documents as Zunbil. But this is Rutbil, the ruler of the region, of whom we know throughout the 8th and 9th century, and who finally actually gets defeated by Yaqub al-Layth al-Safar after 861. So really survives a long time in that region as a local ruler and title. The rest of the titles are mentioned in various places. None of them, as I say, are mentioned in this necessarily order. We have cases such as Lord of the State, which I wasn't sure where to put because it seems to be just the owner of a state. So it is a, it's probably a member of the nobility, and it uses the very common Iranian word Khode, which just means the Lord. And I'm not sure it's even an administrative position. It just might be basically a position, a title referring to one's position in social setting. And some of these, such as the justiciar or Ladobar, that which would be Middle Persian would be Dadobar, so the deliverer of justice, are again, I'm not sure if they place in local administration in any particular order. Priests and eunuchs I've included because they're given administrative roles, not because they're officially administrators. Citizens that are referred to as Sherigan, so the people of the city, is quite interesting. In many, because Bactrian documents are mostly legal documents, and mostly the records of legal cases brought to the Khar of Rob as the high justiciar of the region for him to rule on. And a lot of times the people being addressed or the people suing for a case are actually referred to as citizens. Which I think is quite interesting because their connection to a city is actually here very clearly mentioned. Obviously, there is a general reference to assemblies of freemen, which comes from, the word would come from azad, which means basically born well, the people who are born well or born freely. Here translated by Sims Williams as free man. And of course, you have the mentions of the slaves, often mentioned in the couplets of slave girls and slaves. Mareg seems to be the most common way of referring to a slave. Throughout, it also is used for a word for a servant. So it's not necessarily all the time within the documents referring to bondage, but it does refer very clearly to bondage in many cases. And there are the cases of buying and selling of the slaves, and also manumission of the slaves. So this would be sort of the administrative divisions that we see in this region, and particularly in the local administration and the mention of the locals, sort of the local city administration and life. Now, physically, there are references to how the city is set up. There is a mention of a citadel and a fortress. It is often the place of the court of the Khar. So the citadel, which it seems to be directly or indirectly under the control of Khar, and I say indirectly because sometimes a castellan, a fortress keeper, is also mentioned, is the place where the actual court is also located. The court is referred to as the court of the Khar. So this word albar is mentioned as the place of the court where the administration of justice happens. There is no reference to market by itself, so a physical market. We have market traders and market overseer. So whether there is a physical place that the market is located, at least in the documents we cannot find. But basically from the Islamic references and from archaeological references, we can see that there are places that are most likely places of commercial exchange. And there are mentions of people visiting markets. So I would imagine market was physically present. But again, the documents don't directly offer evidence for market being a physical place people go to. There is a word for estate, which cognates with Middle Persian dastgird, which we know as royal or sort of agricultural estates, which here seems to suggest a more rural setting as well. But there are several words used for properties. Angargo and bonag. Bonag is mostly used as property in a legal sense, so property that you hold in rights, while the angargo is the word that is talking about the actual property. So when you're talking about the selling of a property where boundaries are set, this other word is used. And of course, the word house itself, kadak, where the physical place of the houses are. So from the documents, what we generally see is these properties being sold all around town and in the rural areas, and the place of the citadel and probably the market. So again, it doesn't give us a very good sense of the physical setting of the city that much, but rather on how it is structured and how it is divided and how it is ruled. Socially, you have mentions of citizens, particularly sharig, as I mentioned, which directly refers to shahr, a city. You have mention of house in the sense of, extended house. We have also the word for household of somebody, which refers to actual physical place of the house, as you can see, kadgigan, which refers to this word kadag. We have the word family, which from its root, from tokhmig, it seems to refer to the actual, the origin, genealogical origin of people. So family in the larger sense of a genealogical, people from a genealogical background. There is a very interesting use of the word person, because it's actually legally is mentioned. This masculine is mentioned as the word for a person who is actually involved in legal settings. And it's mentioned that the person who is a woman, a person who is a man. So it's very clear legally what they are referring to. And children, Zadak. So generally, I would say that what we can conclude is that the socially, the city or the population is divided into families, including households, and these households have members of the city, sharik, or just various legal individuals, and of course, men or women, and of course, children mentioned as members of this. So the setup is family-based. I would shy away from calling it the tribe. We have no mention of the tribe directly, but we do have mention of these households in a larger sense, and many people are connected to it. So maybe extended family would be more prudent, but than actual tribes. But I would imagine this is the setting we are talking about, and that there are extended families dominating the social setting within which citizens have certain rights as legal persons, whom we see constantly. A lot of times, the people who are in the legal cases are suing for different cases in groups and in family settings. So you have brothers suing at the same time for something, brothers collectively claiming right over a property and asking the court to exclude others' claim from it. You have a mention of somebody, a mention of basically a polyandry, where one person, one woman marries several brothers again, which seems to be reinforcing this idea of the property and the greater family setting. And of course, even when slaves are mentioned, they are mentioned as slaves or retainers or members of the house, these greater households. We have cases of them being rented out for work, or people renting out themselves for work, obviously, but as part of that household setting. So I would say that household is a very prominent part of the society in this region. So far, I hope I have given not too confusing of a picture of what I meant. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that from the Bactrian documents, we get a setting of various physical organizations of the place and social organization as well, both in the administrative sense and in participatory sense. We get the names and sort of organization of various cities and their local administrators and their dealings with each other. So we also have the names of kings of other places, including Mayam, the king of Kazakhstan, including Mayam is also mentioned as somebody who is a defendant in a lawsuit. So these other administrators seem to be coming in for legal proceedings. Certainly the king of Gard is also mentioned as somebody who comes in both as somebody who acts as a justiciar, but also I think a plaintiff in a case. And you have these mentions of, again, the families who are involved in the buying and selling of the properties and side of the contracts, also having administrative rules other places. So Julad or Junlad, for example, one of the characters that is mentioned in some of the documents as a side of some of these legal documents, is also mentioned as a king, at a different place, and we have coins of him as well. So it shows that this local administration of the Khar as the major justiciar has authority even over the foreign authorities from neighboring regions who come in and who hold property within the area of his rule, and shows the relationship between these various regions. Now, what I'm going to go towards and hopefully finish is this idea of how this setting becomes what we call the Khorasan. Going to political history, Sasanians really lose the East after 484. This probably includes the losing of the region of Abar Shahr, where Heftalites come to control Abar Shahr, so the area of Nishapur, Merv, and Bactria. And this is when we also have mention of Tukharistan and Qarshistan as particular regions of the East in the documents as well. So I would say after 484, you have a Hephthalite kingdom forming in the East. We have little mention of the Hephthalites, interestingly enough, in the area, in the period after this, because since Sasanians seem to really give up on any control of the East, the only way we have references to the Hephthalites is after this point where the king of the Sasanians, Kavad, the son of Peruz, goes twice to the Hephthalite court to ask for help and gets military support for his reclaiming of the Sasanian crown. But the Hephthalite organization itself is very barely mentioned in the Western sources. Within the Bactrian documents, we get ideas of taxes imposed by the Hephthalites on the locals. So we have mention of a Hephthalite tax for which several local people have to sell their land in order to be able to pay the tax. There is, as I mentioned, there is a mention of the Yabghu of Heftal, and at one point, the Khar of Rob is also called the scribe of the Hephthalite lord. But apart from the taxation, we don't see a great involvement of the Hephthalites, at least in the kingdom of Rob, which tells you about the resilience and continuity of the local administration in the region, that it's really not affected, except in important matters such as taxation. Hephthalites do not seem to be in this period, are actually participating much in the affairs of the West. So after Kavad establishes himself as the king in 498, and as I've argued some other places, Sasanians completely shift their attention to the West. The Hephthalites really start disappearing from at least the affairs of the western part of the empire. Until around 560, when an attack by the Western Turks, the empire of the Göktürk, on the Hephthalites allows Khosrow I, the Sasanian king of kings, to reclaim and recapture parts of the East. So we know that the Western Turk offensive against the Hephthalites culminates really in the Battle of Bukhara, or Gulzar, I think battle after Gulzarian Bukhara, which really destroys the Hephthalite power in Transoxiana and probably forces them to withdraw from anything west of their traditional Tukharistan territory. We have mention of Sasanian control of the city of Balkh, in fact, although that doesn't seem to last long. At least in the coinage, we see that soon enough we have the coinage of Turkish rulers. And after this period, the history of the region very much becomes a matter of the authority of the Western Turk Empire. And it gets divided into what the great French scholar François Grenet has called the Hephthalite kingdoms, the sub-Hephthalite kingdoms of the later periods, which are probably the people whom the Muslim armies meet when they come east. But before this, we have the birth of this idea of Khurasan during the Sasanian period. So again, the word is a direct translation of that Miirosan we have. So the earlier word Miirosan now is really just translated into Middle Persian. Both of them mean the place where the sun comes up. I think it is a translation of an Indic name, Udayaditya or Purvaditya. And now we have this Ispahditship of Khorasan, which includes a large part and is probably the root of what Shahristaniya Iran Shahr calls Khorasan and the cities it is describing. But there is this big idea of Khorasan Khorasan existing and having an Isbah bed along with the 4 others, and being a very clearly marked place. Although the eastern part of it, we don't know how much Sasanians have power, say, east of Herat. And is that the reason for the lack of mention of any cities except Balkh in the Bactria region, in Shahristaniha? Herat is mentioned, Marv or Rud is mentioned, Marv is mentioned, but nothing really to the east is mentioned, which I would say might mark the fact that Sasanians really didn't have power anywhere east of Herat in any real sense. Obviously, in the later period, this area of Khorasan becomes an integral part of the early Islamic Empire. It is where the Abbasid revolution of 750 starts in Marv, but again, on the western fringes of this, although we have the participation of everybody from this region, including people from Bactria. And finally, we arrive at this quotation, which I found very interesting, is that it says that Khorasan itself is divided into 4 quarters and is under the control of a paduspan, not an isbah bed. A quarter is under the control of a marzban of Marv of Shahijan. This is the famous Merv. 1 quarter under the control of the marzban of Balkh and Tukharistan. So here Balkh as a region and Tukharistan as a region are actually clearly marked. There's a marzban of Herat and Bushanj and Badghis and Sajistan. So Herat and Bushanj and Badghis and Sajistan are put under the same one. So all the western part, quartered under the control of the marzban of Mawaron, Nahr Transoxiana. So this is obviously, this is Ibn Khordadad, this is the late 9th century. So this is giving the idea of the greater Khorasan, within which Balkh and Tukharistan now form one part. So it's the quarter of the east, Khorasan, itself divided into quarters. So division into 4 is interesting, but particularly Balkh and Tukharistan are mentioned as one of these. I don't want to go through the details of all the cities that Ibn Khordadad mentions, but many of the cities that we saw in the Bactrian documents then get repeated in Ibn Khordadad as the main urban centers of the East, which shows this continuity of the city life and the importance of the cities in the entire region that Ibn Khordadad is mentioning, but particularly in this eastern part. So this is the division. So the Khorasan region, as I mentioned, city of Balkh is the only place it is really might be temporarily under Sasanian rule. This is what happens in the early Islamic period. So as you see, Mawaron Nahr, the eastern parts, and Khorasan as a greater region. And obviously, this is the region where a lot of the main actors of the medieval Islamic world, the Samanid Empire, the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids, come to existence, particularly the Ghaznavid and Ghurids, who are really the rulers of this greater Balkh Bactria. So I hope I have given a general picture of this, the eastern parts, and possibly some of the avenues through which we could look at the life in this region and get through to a little deeper level than just the political history of the region, and try to look at the lives of the people. Of course, the documents, the archaeology, the coinage, and other documents have a lot to tell us about all of these, from legal proceedings to what people ate, to means of production, to the situation with labor, to property and everything else, and can tell us a lot about economic history, about cultural history and everything else. And I hope to have sort of demonstrated the potentials of this sort of studies. And I think for now I should stop and look forward to hopefully discussing this. As the Dutch say, dank u wel.